Hello and welcome to the Presto Classical Podcast. We are at the moment in the midst of awards season, with the Gramophone Awards last month and our very own Presto Awards currently being deliberated upon by our awards committee. A fine time then to cast a historical eye on what became perhaps the most notorious award of the 20th century, the Stalin Prize, which was inaugurated in 1941 in the Soviet Union to reward a wide variety of artistic and scientific disciplines, but would later be caught up in the political and cultural maelstrom that was post-war Soviet Union. The Music Prize would eventually be awarded to some legendary compositions by some well-known composers like Shostakovich and Prokofiev, and we will be discussing their connection to the prize, as well as that of some of lesser-known Soviet composers like Dmitri Kabalevsky and Mstislav Weinberg on the show. My guide is someone who somewhat modestly describes herself on social media as Miss Russian Music, possibly due to the fact that not even the most generous character limit would be sufficient to display her full credentials, being as they are Professor of Music History at Cambridge University, Director of Studies at Music in Clare College, Cambridge, Professor of Music at Gresham College, and author of a wide variety of books on Russian music, most pertinently, Stalin's Music Prize, Soviet Culture and Politics. Welcome to the show, Professor Marina Frolova-Walker.
Hello, hello, Paul, and thank you very much for inviting me. Yes, I laughed when you said Miss Russian Music. I didn't know anyone would notice. Yes, it is a joke, but I'm usually pigeonholed as somebody who only knows about Russian music, and that's why I described myself in this way.
The winners of the first prize, awarded in 1941, included Dmitri Shostakovich, Aram Khachaturian, and Nikolai Miaskovsky. Marina, can you give us a brief overview of how the Stalin Prize functioned on this first year? Why was it set up? Who decided who won? And what was the prize money and prestige of winning?
Yes, well, I guess they always wanted to create a prize which would be like the Nobel Prize, kind of parallel to the Nobel Prize and very prestigious. So at first the idea was that the Stalin Prize would be very, very exclusive and only 10 works in all the arts would get it every year. And it would be awarded to works rather than artists, so not necessarily lifetime achievement. And I think the reason for that was because the Soviet state and the Soviet government wanted to encourage the Soviet intelligentsia to collaborate with them, to create the canon of these works that everyone could imitate and reward them for this participation, for this collaboration, to really create a Soviet elite. That's the moment, when you receive a Stalin Prize first class, and it's just you, it's not a team, it's not divided between anyone. It's 100,000 rubles, and that would allow you at that time to buy 6 automobiles, and you'll still have some spare change left. So it's a fantastical amount of money for an ordinary person, something that they cannot possibly dream of. And who decided? Well, they created the Stalin Prize Committee, and originally they brought together 40 people who were the cultural elite. It included Mikhail Sholokhov, for example, a writer who, as you know, won the Nobel Prize for his novel. Sholokhov never actually turned up, but the other film directors and writers and composers were also all very well known. And they all took these decisions together, but then very soon they found out that their decisions were not the final ones. So eventually it went through several bureaucratic stages up to the Politburo itself and Stalin himself. So Stalin still looked at the final list, but that doesn't mean that he always took all the decisions.
Would it be right to call Nikolai Miaskovsky, one of the first winners, a father figure, both in Soviet composition and on the committee?
Well, maybe not so much a father figure, because he was not the kind to procreate, he was a kind of uncle figure or something like that. But certainly somebody very respected, a professor of the conservatoire, an expert, a person who knew everything, read every single score, was able to make decisions very fast, and basically, was extremely dependable as an expert for the committee. And he was, of course, the professor for almost all Soviet composers. They all came through his school. So he was extremely respected.
Including Shostakovich himself?
Well, Shostakovich didn't quite study with him, because he was in Leningrad rather than Moscow. But he was a rival, I suppose. Became a rival eventually, a rival composition professor.
Could you introduce Miaskovsky's 21st Symphony, which won the prize in 1941?
Yes, very strange win that is, because that's the first, piece that received 100,000 rubles. It was a 20-minute one-movement symphony, which was written actually for the 50th anniversary of the Chicago Symphony, and that created a little bit of consternation when it was brought to the attention of the committee. That tells you that Miaskovsky actually had some international fame, and his symphonies were regularly played during the 20s and 30s. Abroad as well, and it's an elegy. It's actually has a lot of sense of pain in it, and you would wonder, how does it all go with socialist realism at all? And they were slightly worried about the ending, whether there was a ray of light or not at the end. But it somehow reflects the time and the frame of mind of Soviet people at that time very well. I want to quote the words of my teacher, Ekaterina Mikhailovna Tsareva, to whom this book is dedicated, because when she introduced us as teenagers to the symphony, she said, and when the allegro starts after this very, very painful introduction, it's like he is going to work, dutifully going to work. And that Miaskovsky writes so many themes like that like really present this, despite all the awful things that are happening, I'm going to take my briefcase and go to work. And this says of kind of duty and resignation. I think it's a beautiful symphony, and they were certainly right to give it the prize.
Well, let's have an excerpt then. So this is Miaskovsky's 21st Symphony, performed by the State Academic Symphony Orchestra of Russia, conducted by Yevgeny Svetlanov. Why do you feel Miaskovsky's music is somewhat neglected these days? As you said, he was very popular in the 20s and 30s.
Yes, I think it's probably kind of daunting to think that he wrote 27 symphonies. Nobody can go through that much music. And I think the way to bring him back is really to discard most of them and concentrate on the best ones. And I heard Vladimir Yurovsky play the sixth, which is quite extraordinary symphony. The problem with it is too long, would have benefited from some cuts. But it is a great symphony. But there are other ones, like number 13, which is striking. He was scared of getting it performed in the Soviet Union because it was so incredibly depressive, and very dissonant as well. So number 13, number 27, very beautiful, 21. So I think if we get 4 or 5 symphonies together and do a kind of Miaskovsky festival, I think people will start loving him more.
Perhaps the qualities in his music were very appealing in the 20s and 30s, which were periods of political unease.
Yes, he was had a double style really. One style was very easy and melodic. It's like the Fifth Symphony. It's connected to Glazunov, and that had no problem. But he had this other much more abrasive and extremely sort of depressed music. Very gloomy music came out. It's kind of a Tchaikovsky, but much worse than that.
Well, alongside Miaskovsky in 1941, the Armenian Aram Khachaturian also won, although only a second-class prize for his violin concerto. What was the influence of folkish elements on Khachaturian's musical style?
Yes, well, Khachaturian, he studied in Moscow, and he very much absorbed this Russian Orientalist school. And he decided to fashion himself, I think, from the start as this kind of nationalist composer of Armenian music, although I think his background is slightly more complicated. He was born in Tbilisi and so on. And when you look closely at his music, yeah, there are occasionally some folk songs in it, but most of the material he invents himself. And to say that this is definitely Armenian, it's not possible to say that. And some of the idioms that he uses are just more generally Russian Oriental. Some of the idioms he uses are Spanish. Yeah, because Spanish is also this kind of Orientalist style, and he was very influenced, especially in his piano music, by Albanese and Granadas, and you can hear it. Yeah, so it's kind of, but it went with the image of him as this hot, temperamental Armenian, and he was pigeonholed forever in this style. And eventually, in 1947, I think he decided to break out and wrote his third symphony, and that ended very badly for him because he was denounced as a formalist. So, and he was traumatized by this for the rest of his life. So he could never escape, this pigeonhole in which he essentially, put himself. But then these limitations were the end.
Well, let's have an excerpt. This is Aram Khachaturian's violin concerto, performed by David Oistrakh, the Philharmonia Orchestra, and conducted by Aram Khachaturian. How much importance was placed on making sure the other Soviet socialist republics, apart from Russia, were represented in the Stalin Prize?
Oh yes, that was extremely important. That's what completely messed up all the results in the first year, because the Stalin Prize committee had their own ideas of who they wanted to award. But the Politburo made up a second-class prize, which they would give to the composers from national republics. And this is why Khachaturian, by the way, was moved to the second class, because originally I think they wanted to give him the same as to everyone else. But so in this first year, it was very, very obvious that they gave a Georgian composer second-class prize, an Armenian, and Ukrainian, Belarusian, and it was just kind of very, very obvious and specific. So it was very important to encourage various republics. At later stage, when the Baltic republics join, the Soviet Union, intelligentsia there needs to be rewarded also for their cooperation. So they get quite a lot of prizes as well. So at every stage, it was a very important political point.
I suppose if one was around these days, one would call it diversity.
Well, the national policies of Stalin were interesting. It was his great pride. He was a specialist in nationalism. This is what was his main. From 1913, he wrote his first article, and to some extent, you can say that they were successful. Because the country stayed together until 1991, and there was not very much conflict until then, and they were allowed to develop their languages up to a point. There was not so much of forced Russification. There were periods when these languages were suppressed, but not all the time. So even though they all had to sort of do the Western things, they had to have an opera in Kazakhstan and an opera in Tajikistan and so on. But nevertheless, there was some sense that they were all modernizing and developing culturally. So it's you can't quite say that it was a failure.
One of the more interesting but still lesser known composers of this period was Dmitry Kabalevsky. Could you give us a brief introduction to this composer and his second string quartet, which won the Stalin Prize in 1946?
Yes, Kabalevsky is a very good composer. He was very, very talented. He had a lot of early success. He was quite a lot of success in the West because the export agency in the Soviet Union managed to export some of his piano pieces. Yeah, and they became the pieces that everyone plays when they're children. Yeah.
Was that a source of foreign currency?
Yes, I'm sure it was. So he was one of the beneficiaries of this. And he was very good with these educational pieces. Wrote a lot of concertos as well, yeah, for young performers. So he was very talented. I mean, politically speaking, he was not resisting to the state at all. He would sail with the wind always. But at the same time, he didn't do anything absolutely terrible. Yeah, so he's kind of still managed to gain some sort of respect. I remember him at the end of his life, being still very respected, not seen as a villain like Renike, for example. Yeah, so he was in the middle somewhere. But nevertheless, the second quartet, it's obvious that he loves Prokofiev. Yeah, Kabalevsky for him, Prokofiev was an idol. He imitated his music in every piece, and did it very successfully. But it was a dangerous thing to do, yeah, because during the 40s, attitudes to Prokofiev changed. So he had to kind of moderate his love for Prokofiev, I think, at some point. And here he moderates it with Tchaikovsky. So it's a kind of combination. So he is an eclectic, but I think this quartet is terrific. It would be a great, for lots of quartets to include this in their repertoire would be a very interesting thing to do. There's lots of interesting textures, and it is quite, very emotional at times. It has great tunes, and so I think it's a very, very worthy piece again.
Well, let's hear a bit of it then. This performed by the Stenhammer Quartet. The quartet was billed as representing the victory of the Soviet people, but although I enjoyed it, I have to say I struggled to find a strong narrative. How important was finding or even inventing a narrative on largely abstract instrumental music in determining what was worthy of a prize?
Yes, well, as something that was written during the war or after the war, it automatically received this war narrative. Yeah, so especially here, yeah, there are these funeral moments. I think both in the first and the second movement, and a bit in the third. That was supposed to represent, I think, the tragedies and losses of World War II. But yes, the narrative was hugely important because, how would you explain what music is about to those on the committee, for example, who are not musicians? Yeah, and they say, oh, we don't understand anything about the music. But if you tell them that it's a piece, about the victory of the Soviet people in the war, then they will treat it, more positively. So it was hugely important. I call them phantom programs, because they are not programs necessarily written in the score, but they also surround the piece like a cloud. These programs could have been created by musicologists or by critics or by the composers themselves. And of course, in all the debates that I read through, and all the minutes and transcripts of those meetings, these narratives are used all the time.
They're a way of explaining music to people, as you said, who aren't the most musically literate, but are still on the committee in determining what wins.
Yes, exactly. And same, in the musical press, every piece had to have some kind of content, because it was all about content. Music couldn't be just form, because then it's formalist. So you had to have this sort of human, real-life content, and the only way to perceive it was through some kind of verbalization.
And I guess that specific to music has perhaps the most abstract form of art that was worthy or what that was considered for Stalin Prizes. Paintings, sculptures, this type of thing would be more obvious to a committee member what this was referring to than a piece of instrumental music.
Yes, exactly. And music, they always struggled with. And sometimes they said, let's get musicians to decide it. We don't understand anything. I mean, it's still the case, isn't it? Yeah, everyone can talk about literature, everyone can talk about film. The moment you get to music, nobody knows anything.
A composer who increasingly noticeably failed to win any Stalin Prizes was Mieczysław Weinberg, despite the advocacy of his good friend Dmitri Shostakovich. Why was that?
Yes, well, when we remember even the first fact about him, that he fled the Nazis. Yeah, he fled into the Soviet Union. It was a kind of very tragic, flight from fascism, and his family died in Poland. I think that in itself, the fact that he was a kind of foreign, would have set them apart. But he was also considered very talented, and his music was played for the committee even before he was nominated. It was, so somebody was pulling strings for him. I think it could have been Shostakovich, could have been somebody else at that point. But I think he could have won maybe in the first couple of years of the committee. But when his music was actually played, these other voices, the voices of the demagogues who saying the people will reject that. The people don't need music like this. It's too dissonant. It's too gloomy. It's too much like Shostakovich. It's even worse than Shostakovich. Yeah. So Weinberg didn't have a chance with that. And of course, later on, again, Shostakovich was trying to promote him. But later on, when the campaign, euphemistically named, against ruthless cosmopolitanism, but it was essentially an anti-Jewish campaign. When that started, then Weinberg became a little bit of a persona non grata, because most of the music that he wrote was actually on Jewish themes. Even though it was published, he even was published during the campaign. They published his Sinfonietta on Jewish theme in 1949. So that there's no logic in how this develops. But you still have Galavanov, the conductor, saying, why are we considering this? It's all on Jewish themes.
Case of bad timing, perhaps, because Shostakovich's second piano trio, which does feature Jewish melodies, won in 1946. But by the time that the Rhapsody on Moldavian Themes is being considered, that is now not acceptable.
Yes, I think, in connection with Shostakovich Trio, nobody even mentioned that there were Jewish themes in it. They just liked the themes. They thought it was like, they were very exciting themes to tap their foot to, I don't think it was ever said. And the trio actually won the prize in preference to the Eighth Symphony, because it was more accessible to people. So that's an interesting story in itself. But for Weinberg, his Rhapsody on Moldavian Themes, which again, is a slightly euphemistic title. Moldavian Themes. Moldavia was one of the 15 republics. So it was legitimate folk music.
Well, let's have an excerpt of Weinberg's Rhapsody on Moldavian Themes, performed by the Staatskapelle Dresden and Mikhail Jurovsky. The music of Weinberg is now winning awards, including the Gramophone and the Grammys, and has increasing popularity. Is his increasing popularity perhaps assisted by the fact that he was neglected by the Stalin Prize? The Stalin Prize is now a poison chalice.
I think not so much even the story of the Stalin Prize, but the story of his arrest. Yeah, because that sort of captured people's imagination. He was arrested after this piece, Rhapsody on Moldavian Themes, was played by Oistrakh, performed at the conservatoire on that day. But amazingly, I mean, we shouldn't draw this connection, which seems to be so obvious, that he was arrested for his music. Yeah, because his family was under observation, for a long time, because he was married to the daughter of Solomon Mihoils, who was the most famous Jew in the Soviet Union, as head of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, who was murdered by Stalin in February 1948. Of course, nobody at that time, it was described as a traffic accident, but people knew. So he was arrested, and then the what they wanted to charge him with was bourgeois nationalism, or Jewish nationalism, I think. And it was just before Stalin died. So he was literally arrested in February. Stalin died like 2 weeks later, and then a couple of months later, he was released. And Shostakovich fought for him for his release. But that, of course, together with the kind of music that he wrote, music about concentration camps and all. He also wrote a massive number of symphonies, massive number of chamber music. And it's all now being discovered, and people realize that some of this music is exceptionally good. Yeah, some of it possibly not so much, but yeah, he's a great discovery.
Similarly to Miaskovsky, wrote a very large amount of music, and now it's just the best bits that are now being rediscovered and performed again.
Yes, I think that's the way to approach it. Yeah, we shouldn't think that everything is a masterpiece.
While Weinberg failed to win any, Sergei Prokofiev was the all-time winner with 6 Stalin Prizes, remarkably dying on the exact same day as Stalin. Can you give us a brief overview of Prokofiev's complex relationship with his homeland?
As we know, Prokofiev spent a long time abroad, from 1918 to roughly 1935, and then he decided to come back to the USSR, which in itself was, I guess, quite unusual among musicians, not so unusual generally among the Soviet artistic intelligentsia. So, and when he returned, he really wanted to get stuck in and wrote some very ideologically correct words, or he thought they were correct. They actually turned out to be not, like his cantata for the 20th anniversary, which he thought, well, what's better to do than set some words by Stalin to music?
Through a megaphone, no less.
I mean, really. He was very wrong about that. But he also had some successes, like a Toast to Stalin, Zdravitsa, that was quite popular. So still people referred to him as somebody who hadn't quite unpacked his suitcases. He sort of came back, but he's still a Western composer. He, of course, was terribly sort of not politically correct in the way he spoke. He kept saying, that we're so far behind the West, we have to learn, and so on. So you could see how different he was from the Soviet composers who already had the lingo. And this is why in the first 2 years he couldn't win anything, which was to the great consternation of the committee, because they realized that Prokofiev's music possibly was the best, from everything that was presented there. And some of the things, like Alexander Nevsky, was very much, people's music. But there was a resistance to that in the government, especially the Minister of Culture. It was called Hrabchenko. So he spoke against Prokofiev very strongly. But amazingly, he changed his mind about Prokofiev when he started working with him on War and Peace, which became this kind of national opera project. And Prokofiev just charmed him, I guess. He sort of felt, I think, chuffed, to even know such great genius, and began supporting him, started to support him. And that's how he received his prize for the 7th Piano Sonata in 1940, which was written in 1943.
That seems a remarkably avant-garde piece to win the Stalin Prize. Did it slip through the net, perhaps?
Yes, absolutely. That's what it did. I think Prokofiev couldn't understand himself why they chose this. Yeah, why they wouldn't award Alexander Nevsky and they would award the Seventh Piano Sonata. But several factors played their role. One of them was the fact that it was time to give Prokofiev a prize, and this is what he released. Another reason was that Sviatoslav Richter just played it, and everyone was just astonished. Yeah, but there's some things which are aesthetically so irresistible, that you have to give them a prize. And the way Richter performed it just captured their imagination. And they created this war narrative for it. Yeah, so because it was 1943, maybe it's the Stalingrad Sonata or something like that. Maybe it's all quite gloomy at the start and then and menacing, and then in the finale you have this great triumph of the Russian forces, which of course is I think ridiculous, but because the music tells you a different story. I think the music is connected to Prokofiev's images of devilish obsession, and possession, and also there are elements of jazz, the kind of blue notes in it in the finale. So there's Stravinsky influence in it. So it's I think it's a sonata he wrote to play on his US tour, which never took place. I think that's what it was done for. But interesting story. Nevertheless, now that it's got the Stalin Prize, people get completely wrong ideas about it.
Well, let's have an excerpt of Prokofiev's Seventh Piano Sonata, performed by, of course, Sviatoslav Richter. You've talked there about the performance of Sviatoslav Richter and in the awarding of the prize for the Seventh Piano Sonata. How much influence did performers themselves have on who was considered for awards?
Well, there were, of course, performers on the committee, such as Alexander Goldenweiser, for example, who he was a composer as well, or he wanted to be considered a composer. So he played a very important role. He, I think, discussed almost everything that there was, participated always in every discussion. I guess performers. He also proposed that the performers would be actually awarded, the instrumentalists in particular, because originally prizes went straight to singers of the Bolshoi theater, because Stalin was personally interested in the singers of the Bolshoi theater. So they were always very well served by the prize. But instrumentalists actually could receive only one prize in their lifetime, because it didn't feel to them like it was like a new work. If you prepared a new program, no matter how many times, for example, Richter would play, he would only be eligible for one prize, a single prize.
Prokofiev's last win was for his Seventh Symphony, awarded after both Prokofiev and Stalin had died. Could this be viewed as a sort of lifetime achievement award, so beloved of award ceremonies these days?
Yes, it was the ending of a very long saga over Prokofiev's Seventh Symphony. They discussed it 3 times, I think, in the committee when Prokofiev was still alive. And every time, amazingly, there was some resistance to giving him a prize. And it's quite extraordinary, because the symphony is quite innocuous when you compare it even, to the Seventh Sonata. It's a very lyrical style, and I think Prokofiev was slightly embarrassed, the simplicity that he perpetrated there, that he actually sort of suggested that it was for children or for young people or something like that. So, and nevertheless, there were detractors of Prokofiev at that point. This is already, after he had been denounced as a formalist. And he had a particular hard time because he, I guess, didn't understand the brief properly. Couldn't really see how he could have done it wrongly, because he really thought he was a composer for the people. He created these amazing melodies. He thought he was doing the right thing. So he took it very badly. So it took him a long time and a lot of help from his friends to get rehabilitated and receive another prize for his cantata, or oratorio rather, On Guard for Peace. So, and the Seventh Symphony, he was already lying basically on his deathbed. He was very sick man, and yet they still couldn't get it through. There was this resistance to the quality of the grotesque, as they called it, which is kind of this very sharp, scherzo type music that Prokofiev was, of course, famous for and is famous for. But it was okay during the war, because you could also say, well, these are the Nazis. But here, in these years, there was something that some people perceived was mocking. What is this music mocking? And that's the nature of Prokofiev's style. It always mocks everything. So you couldn't really do anything. So that's why after Prokofiev died, the first Lenin Prize was given to the symphony, because they remembered it as a great injustice done to this great artist.
Well, let's have an excerpt of the Seventh Symphony performed by the London Symphony Orchestra and conducted by Valery Gergiev. Undoubtedly, the most discussed composer of this period is Dmitri Shostakovich, who was accused of muddle instead of music by possibly Stalin himself after his opera Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk in 1936. Could his 1941 win for his piano quintet be viewed as rehabilitation by the Soviet state?
He was sort of rehabilitated by his Fifth Symphony already, in 1937, even though it wasn't ever considered as complete, because the Fifth Symphony was still controversial, if you look at all the reviews. But indeed, the quintet was suddenly this piece that just everyone loved. Everyone on the committee truly, truly loved it. It was lucky, I guess, that it was also very well played and played several times in a row, so that actually sort of familiarized the ears with it. And it was seen as a very sunny piece, although today we might not necessarily hear it like this, and the ending is quite ambivalent in a sense. It's not the big triumph, but nevertheless, it was just, I suppose, exceptionally fortunate also to be seen as this socialist realist piece, even though it's basically a piece of musical neoclassicism.
Okay, well, let's have an excerpt from the Shostakovich Piano Quintet performed by the Artemis Quartet and Elizabeth Leonskaya. Shostakovich was on the panel for the Stalin Prize for some years and often behaved quite deviously on it. Can you give some highlights from his time on the panel?
Yes, that's a very interesting lens to look at Shostakovich through the prism of the Stalin Prize Committee transcripts, because he comes into it really full of ideas that he has to criticize everything. So he actually speaks his mind, I like this, I don't like this is rubbish, and so on. He is not a really committee man at all. But he speaks his mind, and later on, of course, he's removed from the committee. In 1948 again, as he is declared as formalist, and then he's reinstated on the committee. And when he comes back, it's a very different man. He's completely cynical. Basically, just tries to use the committee to promote his friends. Totally cynical way. Still doesn't have the admin know-how of how to actually achieve this. But he certainly uses it to vent his frustration. He tells everyone off. He says, we should give Sviridov the prize. We should give Weinberg the prize. We should give Levitin the prize, which are all kind of either his students or disciples. And sometimes would fight for them, even though he is the only vote. So I can think Weinberg piece. Received one vote, which was his. And would write letters knowing that it's pointless, but just basically just venting. I think. But that is quite interesting to see him as actually not a shy man, or not a man of kind of who's withdrawing from all these debates, but on the contrary, somebody who tries to fight, even in a slightly sort of awkward way, I guess.
Would it be fair to say that the quality of compositions, both by Shostakovich and others, that ended up winning the Stalin Prize declined over the years that it was awarded, and why would that be?
It's very hard to say. Song of the Forests, I know that's what you mean, which was given the prize post-1948, which was his rehabilitation prize. I think it's still a great work, It's very well done. The problem is it's in this very official genre of an oratorio. But as an example of that genre, it's probably, the very top. So I don't think Shostakovich was necessarily kind of embarrassed by the quality of it. I think he was embarrassed by the fact that he had to write this, essentially for Stalin's birthday. And using, as a theme, Stalin's reforestation plan. Actually, I suppose it's very good now. It's an ecological, thing. It's a green plan. It was post-war, so sort of putting all these trees down. So I don't think it's so much the quality, but it's the choice of works that they now make. So they would argue forever about his 10th symphony. But at the same time, they want to award his party cantata or something, which indeed, he was embarrassed by. And he said, "Oh, please, don't give me the prize for this." And yet at the same time, his preludes and fugues are considered, which is a very different kettle of fish. So it's complicated what happens with Shostakovich, but certainly, things are still remain difficult for him in this period. And of course, the works that he actually writing in that period between 48 and 53, he doesn't show to anyone. Such as a violin concerto.
Well, let's have an excerpt so we can judge for ourselves the quality of the Song of the Forests, performed by the Alexei Tonovitsky, Konstantin Andreev, the Estonian National Symphony Orchestra, the Estonian Concert Choir, Narva Boys Choir, conducted by Paavo Järvi. In 1979, Solomon Volkov's testimony was published, arguing that Shostakovich expressed anti-Soviet sentiments through his music and remains controversial to this day. Could it be argued that testimony has legitimised Shostakovich as a dissident in the West?
Yes, I have to say that the testimony produced this very, very seismic shift in the Western reception of Shostakovich, because before that he was considered a kind of not very interesting party composer. People were looking down on him, and suddenly he becomes this dissident. I mean, it's a pity that the shift was produced by the book, which purports to be what it is not. It's not a Shostakovich memoir. That has been proven. That's not what Shostakovich wanted to read you to read as his memoir. Yeah, it's a collection of stories, some stemming probably from Shostakovich, some from his friends, some of his old interviews, everything cobbled together. So it's not really, I think, the tone of voice that he would like you to hear, but somehow this tone of voice became Shostakovich voice, and the image that this book portrays became the image of Shostakovich. And lots of us, have been so fighting against it up to an extent, because, of course, to an extent, there are true things in it which have been corroborated by other things like the memoirs that Elizabeth Wilson published. But these stories, that circulate and that are partially found in this book, these stories belong to this genre of baika. Yeah, it's a story post-vodka, storytelling, which Russian musicians of then and of now, always indulged in. And these stories, including the stories told by Shostakovich, might have some truth in them, might have 20% of truth, might have 0% of truth, might have 80% of truth. I've compared various stories in my book, actually, about a certain event, and they're completely different, they're different, very significant details. So you can never trust these bikers, you can never trust them completely. You can just get the flavor of the times from them. Especially what Rostropovich says, never believe him. So anyway, yes, it certainly, legitimized Shostakovich as a dissident, and he of course was much more complex figure than that.
It presents an easy narrative that the truth is actually a lot more complex.
A lot more complex, because he was also a member of the establishment. I mean, he was a deputy of the Supreme Soviet. He had a very privileged existence, extremely privileged, actually, throughout his life, despite, being very harshly criticized. He had, was materially insulated at almost every point, with a very few exceptions. Of course, all his music was always performed, unlike Prokofiev's music. So he was very fortunate in that respect as well. And even the works that were banned at some point, such as Lady Macbeth and The Nose, wasn't played for a long time, the Fourth Symphony, they all came back. So he lived long enough. So he was, again, more fortunate than Prokofiev, who just died on the same day as Stalin. So he had no chance to experience the period of reprieve and rehabilitation and freedom. So, so Shostakovich was both the beneficiary of the system in a huge way. He could write to the government to say, I need this, I need that, I need the flat in Moscow, I need the dacha, my Stalin prizes are not enough to pay for this all, So, and at the same time, a great pain of compromise and, of course, constantly having this sort of Damocles, hanging over him that he might be denounced again, because there's always, he was denounced twice. Again, nobody was denounced twice. So he got the most of the grief and also most of the praise.
In conclusion, how do you feel the Stalin Prize continues to influence how we view these composers, for good and bad?
Well, I don't think it has such a great influence. First of all, not many people know about it unless they read my book. And of course, more people should read my book. And it is important. I think it gives you a very interesting perspective on the whole history of Soviet music. But I think these days, when people find out, something got the Stalin Prize, and they start thinking, why would that be? So just my warning is don't just make a simple decision that this is because Stalin liked it. Yeah, this is what I was trying to argue against in my book. It's not like he just pulls the prize out of his, white trousers and out of his pocket and gives them. That's not what happened. Yeah, it was very much a collective decision. Apart from very few cases when he really had a very personal influence. It was a collective decision, and very often it was based on aesthetic grounds rather than political grounds. The balance was shifting all the time. So in order to understand why this or that work has a Stalin Prize, you really need to go into the nitty-gritty. What year was that? What was the situation? Who was supporting this person? And so on and so forth. So it's a complicated story, but I don't think any work should be, thought of as particularly good or particularly bad just by virtue of having a Stalin Prize. Yeah.
Is there a lesson, perhaps all awards for artistic endeavours, that they must try and resist the urge to become too political?
Well, it's not possible. Every jury that I've sat on always has the element of politics, and I think that's what we know that's going to be there, because it's just otherwise if we just go with what we think as the absolute quality, you might end up awarding the same person. Yeah, it almost happened in the Stalin Prize committee when they started awarding Prokofiev every year, because the quality was so high. But other people also need to be rewarded. You need to somehow sort of spread the goods around. So I don't think we can get rid of politics, but it's so that we don't completely throw our ideas of what is good musically or artistically, so that we don't forget them completely. Don't go against our sort of artistic consciences.
Perhaps the lesson is not to try and be unbiased, but to be aware of our own biases.
Yeah, well, that's what we're trying to do. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Marina. Should you wish to further explore this fascinating period of cultural history, then Marina's book, Stalin's Music Prize, Soviet Culture and Politics, is available in our Presto bookstore. What are you currently working on, Marina?
Well, currently I'm in the last stages of preparing a manuscript for publication, and it's on Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony. I've written it together with my husband, Jonathan Walker, and it's basically an attempt to look at this very controversial work, very famous work, from different perspectives, and to say something maybe slightly new about it, which is very difficult, but I think we've managed maybe to create some new arguments. So I very much wait for this moment when it's going to be published, and people will stop asking me questions about the Fifth Symphony.
Well, I've very much enjoyed your book on the Stalin Prize, so I eagerly await your book on the Fifth Symphony. Thank you very much again. Thanks to my producer, Matt Groom, and thanks to you for listening.